Hello, I'm Fred Motson. I'm based at the Open University in the United Kingdom, and my paper is titled Future Law for Future Cities. And essentially, what I've tried to look at in this particular paper is some of the challenges from a legal perspective that smart cities and cities of the future might create or exacerbate. And some of these challenges already exist and are already being dealt with or not, as the case may be. Others are more hypothetical, are based more in the further future. And because most of the paper is looking forwards, rather than using real world examples, I've instead looked at a number of examples from speculative fiction across different mediums to illustrate some of the points that I'm making. So in this presentation, I'm going to briefly go through the 5 issues that I've picked out, 5 challenges and 5 future cities that faced each of these challenges. And so we'll start with something which is very much occurring as we speak, which is the increasing prevalence of the so-called Internet of Things. The idea that more and more of the objects that we use in our daily life, both privately in our own homes and in more public spaces, more and more objects that were formerly dumb and passive are now smart and are able to connect, to gather data, and to react to changing situations. And a good example of a world where smart objects have become the norm is that laid out in Cory Doctorow's recent novella, Unauthorized Bread. So in Unauthorized Bread, the heroine Salima can no longer use her toaster because her toaster will only accept authorized bread which has been purchased from a shop authorized by the toaster's manufacturer. And due to a separate legal problem, an issue of data protection, the manufacturer has essentially gone out of business, and her toaster will no longer authorize any bread wherever she may purchase it. The story, as with many of Cory Doctorow's stories, takes on some very big themes, issues around immigration and socioeconomic inequality. But the reason I've chosen it is slightly more everyday, because I think it's a story which illustrates a number of legal issues that arise when we move from a legal system that we currently have that essentially treats objects as passive and something which can be owned and which things can be done to, into a future where objects are active and can themselves essentially be objects, not subjects. And so some of the issues that I highlighted in more detail in the paper are the risk of an internet of junk, something which is already having to be dealt with, recent changes in the law here in England and Wales about the right to repair, the right to keep objects, and for manufacturers to make sure objects continue to work and do not include planned obsolescence. And particularly as we move more and more to objects based on these smart services, the idea, as with Salima's toaster, that even if an object is perfectly fine in mechanical terms, in physical terms, it may not be able, it may not do what it's supposed to do because of a lack of manufacturer support. Another issue that is flagged up in the novel, and another issue which definitely most people are at least vaguely aware of, is the increasing numbers of very complicated terms and conditions that we all are faced with whenever we do everyday activities like internet shopping or buying a new electronic product and turning it on, or installing a new piece of software. And of course, it's a cliche to say that people scroll through, don't read these terms and conditions in great detail. In fact, even if somebody did, it's arguable that without real knowledge both of the law and of the technology involved, it would be very difficult for the average person to understand the terms and conditions. And realistically, what option do we have? The reason many of us do scroll through those terms and conditions is because we want to access the product or the service. We aren't going to take it back to the shop if we find something in that terminology that we disagree with. And this ties into Salima's problem with her toaster, the lack of bargaining power, something that has always been a problem between consumers and large organizations, but is exacerbated by the Internet of Things. That can be because people are tied into an infrastructure or an ecosystem. It can be because of this need to agree to more and more complex contractual provisions. It can be because there are no alternative options. Salima doesn't have a choice now. She can't buy her bread anywhere else. She has to accept what the authorized bread entails. She can't even bake her own bread without cracking the software on her toaster. And another very worrying concern is data mining. What about smart objects which can actually amass data on the user? A very obvious example would be a smart vehicle that gathers information about somebody's driving competence. And of course, that information would be worth an awful lot to, for example, the provider of car insurance. Another issue that I highlight that very much brings together all of those themes that I've mentioned so far is the idea that we are moving, it would seem, toward a system where the default is passive acceptance rather than an active need to consent, which is what the law of contract has traditionally required. And talking of solutions, it's notable in the novella that the solution, the only solution that Salima and her neighbours can find, is in itself illegal. It is outside of the law and in defiance of the law. And that would suggest or illustrate a situation where the law has failed to come to terms with technological development and how that changes our existing legal principles. Short clip to introduce the next element. This clip from the film Minority Report. So we can see here our hero of the film, John Anderson, being addressed by name in advertisements and indeed in shops. A different name there because by this point in the film he's had to undergo an eye transplant to avoid this automatic identifying. But an extreme example that demonstrates a problem which is already again arising in our current cities, which is that in any kind of smart city, and in order for a smart city to operate, there needs to be the collection of data. Many smart systems do not work without appropriate data. And so if we're collecting data, that then leads to the question of how that data should be used, who should have the right to collect the data, and who should have the right to use it for what purposes. And it's easy to imagine in the future smart city that there will always be an inherent pressure toward wider and deeper use of data that is being collected. So, for example, a smart traffic system will need to track where vehicles are at any given time. What happens when the police ask to access that data in order to eliminate a suspect from a murder inquiry? What about if the police ask to use that data to help prosecute a suspect? What about if, as will inevitably be the case, private actors are collecting that data and private actors are potentially utilizing that data? This data is worth an awful lot of money, of course, as well. And so even in a situation where the data is heavily controlled, there will be a major incentive on those controlling that data to allow others access to it. So a number of legal issues there. In particular, in a smart city, is it possible to have a right to privacy? Can we operate a system which at the minute we tend to use with provisions like the GDPR in EU law, where we require consent to our data being collected and processed? Is that possible in a smart city where data is being collected, all types of data is being collected in all types of ways at all times? And so in my paper I expand on whether the smart city is compatible with a right to privacy. The third issue raised in my paper is illustrated by the television show Person of Interest, based in current times but with a very far future artificial intelligence that is able to process huge amounts of data and predict essentially that crimes will take place. The idea in Person of Interest is not in itself new, but the idea of using an artificial intelligence rather than some form of sort of psychic or precognitive person is one that is grounded at least partly in reality and in existing technology. It's clear already that there is a move toward predictive policing and the use of data and surveillance in particular in order to help police the city. Again, in my country, in England, you only need to visit a major city to see how pervasive closed circuit television, CCTV, has become. And so it's far from unlikely that increasingly artificial intelligences or algorithms, at least in the short term, electronic technological systems will be used to increasingly process that data and to prioritize how policing takes place in the smart city. There are a number of concerns from a legal standpoint, most notably the prioritizing of resources. Assuming we don't live in a dystopian situation where everything is recorded, how do we decide what to record? How do we decide what we are comfortable with being recorded? How do we decide what we can afford to record? If we have a limit on the resources, how do we prioritize? And there is a real danger that that priority might be prejudiced and discriminatory against certain groups of citizens. How do we prioritize what resources are are then sent to issues. What if a problem in one particular neighbourhood leads to a more complete response than a problem in another neighbourhood, and again potentially continuing or exacerbating existing inequalities. The problem, of course, being that even if the system is itself automated, the system has to have been programmed, and so any bias or prejudice that is programmed in from the start becomes inherent in the system. If we do accept that not everything can be seen, what about the importance of what is not seen? There is, I think, a danger in mindset that if we rely more and more on physical data, data about physical happenings in the world, we also start to look at crimes differently. It's a long-held principle of criminal law that it doesn't just matter what acts somebody does, it matters what their state of mind was when they performed those acts. So, for example, murder requires that somebody not only unlawfully kills another person, but that they intended to kill them. If we focus on the sort of data that we can harvest from physical sensors, we run a risk of focusing on those physical acts, the actus reus of a crime, at the expense of the mental element. And we also lose that human element of judgment in deciding how to interpret the information that is being recorded. One final point, which is particularly brought out by the television show Person of Interest, is the other idea that if we have a system like this, what's more important, transparency or security? Do we need a system where its operation is completely open? We can see how and why the system works and how it arrives at the conclusions it does. Or do we want a system that cannot be tampered with? A black box that the data goes in and the recommended outcomes come out, and there is no access to how the system itself works. Obviously, the more we have one of those, the more we trade off the other. Two further issues: smart transport, particularly driverless cars. How does a system such as the system in England and Wales, which relies on fault and in the context of a road traffic accident generally comes down to whose fault the accident was, how does a system like that operate in a world of smart vehicles? Who's responsible if a smart vehicle is involved in an accident? Even if we can prove the vehicle caused the accident, it drove into another vehicle it should not have done. Who's responsible for that? Is it the driver? Is the driver simply a passenger? Is it the company that manufactured the vehicle? The person or company that programmed the vehicle's software? Potentially, could we even end up with a situation, and certainly some academics have argued for sufficiently advanced artificial intelligences to have their own legal personality? The car itself could stand trial, essentially, for its own negligence. But then if we try to apply existing principles of negligence, we have to ask, well, did the smart vehicle reach the appropriate standard of care? Was it the so-called reasonable robot, as Pywell has written? And so those issues explored in a lot more detail in my paper. I'm aware of the limitations on time, so I will only very briefly mention the final element. I think there is a video there, but I think the picture itself shows most of what we need to know. This is the mega city of Coruscant in the Star Wars universe, and it illustrates in a very extreme method what might happen in our future cities as we run increasingly out of space and we build further up and we build further down into the Earth. The more vertical our cities become, the more we end up with these science fictional cities. We need to think of the city in at least 3 dimensions. not just as a flat two-dimensional map, but going up and going down, and we need to question who owns things such as the airspace around and above buildings, especially as we have already more and more drones in the air. Never mind something like the flying cars we saw in Star Wars. And even the city in 4 dimensions. Buildings increasingly have virtual analogues where modelling takes place. What about the fact that a modern landlord and tenant relationship needs to take account of the fact that people are often not just relying on the physical structure of a building, but on the digital services that the building can provide and the infrastructure. But with time in mind, just a brief conclusion, which again I elaborate on in my paper. What's interesting across all 5 fictional examples I give is that in all of them, technological change has outstripped the law as far as it's explored in those works. And so there is a question as to whether what's been gained is worth what has been lost. And arguably, the law has failed, and the technological solutions have led to inequality and injustice. And so I think that it's very, very important that as we discuss the issues that my fellow panelists and others at this conference are talking about, as we talk about how cities develop, it's crucially important that legal frameworks develop simultaneously with smart development, rather than trying to apply older and perhaps less relevant concepts to cities which have essentially developed beyond the existing law. Thank you very much for joining me, and please do get in touch if you'd like to discuss any of these issues further.